On February 21st, Vietnam's Ministry of Foreign Affairs released a new map of the territorial baseline in the Gulf of Tonkin, quietly extending its maritime boundaries by a significant margin. This was a direct slap in the face of the Chinese Communist Party. Why did Vietnam suddenly adjust its maritime borders? The answer goes back to the March of last year, when the CCP unilaterally announced a new baseline for the Gulf of Tonkin, expanding its territorial waters by a large area, overlapping with international waters by 20 to 50 nautical miles. Vietnam's move was a direct response to China's expansion. Vietnam also hit back economically. On the same day, on February 21st, Vietnam's Ministry of Industry and Trade announced an anti-dumping tariff of up to 27.8% on hot-rolled steel coils from China. The policy will take effect on March 7th and last for 120 days. But here's the question: wouldn't this hurt Vietnam's own economy? After all, 72% of its steel comes from China. Vietnam already thought about this. The official documents clearly state that hot-rolled steel from India will not be subject to the tariff. In other words, Vietnam can simply import steel from India instead of China. Plus, Vietnam mainly uses steel for construction and manufacturing, not for exports to the US, so it's not worried about Washington's 25% tariff on steel. So what's Vietnam's real goal here? It's actually killing two birds with one stone. On one hand, it's reducing its reliance on Chinese steel. On the other hand, it's sending a message to the Trump administration about Vietnam's alliances. Vietnam's exports to the U.S. totaled $120 billion in 2023, mostly electronics, clothing, and footwear. If the United States imposed higher tariffs, Vietnam's economy would take a major hit. By cracking down on Chinese goods, Vietnam is making sure Washington sees it as a cooperative partner, one that's playing by the rules. Just 3 days later, China immediately responded by launching a 4-day live-fire military drill in the Gulf of Tonkin. The artillery fire was deafening, an obvious attempt to intimidate Vietnam. But the tensions between China and Vietnam go beyond just these recent events. On February 19, 2025, a Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson lashed out, warning that China firmly opposes any country carrying out construction activities on illegally occupied reefs. But protests alone don't change reality. Vietnam has already built up its islands, and its airports are already operational. Over the past few years, while China was busy clashing with the US and the Philippines in the South China Sea, Vietnam quickly expanded its presence. By the time Beijing realized what was happening, Vietnam's occupied reefs had grown significantly. Vietnam actually controls more features in the Spratly Islands than China does, 29 in total. It has expanded 10 of them that overlap with China's claimed areas: Bark Canada Reef, Hongqiu Island, Pearson Reef, Discovery Great Reef, Nam Yet Island, Sand Cay, Grierson Reef, Petley Reef, West Reef, and Central Reef. Though Vietnam's total reclaimed area is only half of China's, it still covers 9.5 square kilometers. The most dramatic case is Bark Canada Reef. In November 2023, satellite images showed that this small atoll had been entirely reclaimed into solid land, with a deep water port capable of docking 10,000-ton warships. Then, in August 2024, after Vietnamese General Secretary To Lam took office, he ordered an accelerated land reclamation project, turning Bark Canada Reef into Vietnam's largest military base in the Spratly Islands. Its area has now reached 1.67 square kilometers. Beyond that, Vietnam has now built a large airstrip capable of handling fighter jets on Lad Reef. This means that in the Spratly Islands, Vietnam now has 3 islands with airfields: Lad Reef, Nam Yet Island, and Bark Canada Reef. Its military base network in the South China Sea is basically complete. China had tried to win over Vietnam by promoting transshipment trade through Guangdong and giving Vietnam economic benefits, hoping that Vietnam would stay out of trouble in the South China Sea. But despite taking the benefits, Vietnam went ahead with its island-building plans anyway. Where does Vietnam get this confidence? The answer is To Lam. Born on July 10, 1957, near Hanoi, this strongman in Vietnamese politics became Minister of Public Security in August 2016 and cracked down on corruption, taking down over 2,000 officials. On September 10, 2023, when Biden visited Hanoi, To Lam flew to Beijing on September 17 to show loyalty. Then, on November 12, 2023, he invited Xi Jinping to Vietnam to boost ties. In March 2024, Vietnam's president, Vo Van Tung, resigned. On May 22nd, To Lam took over. In July, To Lam assumed control as General Secretary. By August 3rd, he was officially elected as the head of the Communist Party of Vietnam. In less than a year, he went from a background figure to the most powerful leader in Vietnam. Previously, power was shared among four key figures: the General Secretary, the President, the Prime Minister, and the National Assembly Chairman. But now, To Lam holds both the General Secretary and President positions, making him Vietnam's undisputed #1 leader. This Vietnamese strongman has a grand vision to make Vietnam great again, but he is well aware of a harsh reality. Vietnam is boxed in. To the north, there's China. To the east, there's China's 9-dash line in the South China Sea. If a conflict with China breaks out, Vietnam has no strategic depth and could be easily surrounded. That's why To Lam's top priority is to expand Vietnam's strategic depth, and the key to achieving this is through Cambodia and Laos. Historically, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were all part of French Indochina, a single geopolitical unit. To Lam's idea is simple: rebuild that regional structure and turn Vietnam into a true regional power. Vietnam once stationed 40,000 troops in Laos and propped up a puppet regime in Cambodia. In 1979, China launched a border war against Vietnam to force it to withdraw from Cambodia. Now, To Lam wants to revive that old strategy. After becoming president in May, his first foreign visits were to Laos and Cambodia. In Laos, he discussed giving the country direct access to the sea through Quang Tri province, its shortest route to the ocean. This move directly counters China's efforts in Laos. In recent years, China built a high-speed railway connecting the landlocked country to Thailand, allowing Lao exports to reach the sea via Thailand. Vietnam's countermove was offering Laos an even more convenient route through the Quang Tri. And in Cambodia, he offered cheap transit fees for using the Mekong River. And he did so because China is planning to build a canal in Cambodia, bypassing Vietnam's Mekong Delta and giving Cambodia its own direct access to the sea. It's clear that Vietnam and China are locked in a strategic showdown. Of course, China isn't sitting idly by. It has quietly rolled out countermeasures. First, suddenly, the power transmission line from Guangxi to Vietnam needed maintenance, causing electricity shortages in Vietnam. Second, China doubled down on speeding up construction of Laos's high-speed railway project. And Beijing is pledging even more investment into Cambodia's canal. But Vietnam's challenges aren't just on land. It also faces a major strategic weakness at sea. Its coastline is too close to China's 9-dash line in the South China Sea, making it vulnerable to being attacked in segments if a conflict breaks out. The only solution is to expand its maritime depth. That's why Vietnam has been aggressively seizing islands in the Spratly and Paracel Islands, not just for oil and gas resources, but also to create a security buffer. In July last year, Vietnam submitted a continental shelf boundary proposal to the United Nations. That proposal included both the Spratly and Paracel Islands. But here's the problem: the Paracel Islands are already fully controlled by China. This exposes a major gap in Vietnam's maritime strategy. Vietnam's plans to decouple from the CCP isn't just about geopolitical and strategic depth, it's also about reducing economic dependence on China. In 2024 alone, Vietnam imported $144 billion worth of goods from China, but only exported $61.2 billion to China. That's a massive trade deficit. Meanwhile, Vietnam's trade surplus with the U.S. exceeded $123 billion, making it America's fourth largest trade deficit source. The U.S. will eventually take action, imposing tariffs and sanctions, and a big chunk of Vietnam's exports are actually just Chinese goods re-exported through Vietnam. Vietnam knows this won't last forever, so it's already working on gradually breaking away from China's supply chain. And it's doing so by turning to two major backers, Russia and the U.S. On June 19, 2024, Putin personally traveled to Hanoi and signed 11 cooperation agreements with To Lam. Russia committed $3 billion to help Vietnam build a nuclear power plant. Vietnam is not able to generate enough electricity on its own. During peak summer months, Vietnam often has to buy electricity from China. If China ever decides to cut off power, Vietnam would be in serious trouble. Russia helping Vietnam build nuclear power means Vietnam will no longer be dependent on China for electricity. In terms of arms, in recent years, Russia has sold Vietnam several Kilo-class submarines and Su-30 fighter jets. During Putin's visit, the two countries deepened their military cooperation, giving Vietnam the backing it needs. Russia's military support is one of the key reasons Vietnam feels confident in standing up to China in the South China Sea. But Russia alone isn't enough. The real game changer for Vietnam is the U.S. On July 9th last year, the flagship of the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet, the USS Blue Ridge, along with its Coast Guard patrol vessel, USCGC Witch, sailed directly into Vietnam's Cang Rong Bay, command ship of the 7th Fleet, responsible for communications and coordination. It represents the U.S. military's entire Indo-Pacific command structure. This same ship took part in the 1972 bombing campaign against North Vietnam and the 1975 evacuation of Saigon, and now it was warmly welcomed in Vietnam. This sent a clear message of support from the U.S. And what about the USCGC Witch Patrol vessel? This is a core ship of the U.S. Coast Guard, specifically designed to handle maritime disputes. The U.S. Coast Guard has even been training the Philippines on how to counter China at sea, using its expertise in maritime treaties. Meanwhile, the 7th Fleet serves as the ultimate military force, the last line of defense. If things escalate beyond control, all of this was meant to send a clear message to Vietnam. The U.S. can provide both Coast Guard and Navy support if needed. With strong backing from Russia and growing support from the U.S., Vietnam saw an opportunity. On July 17th last year, it submitted a claim to the United Nations Commission on the limits of the continental shelf, proposing a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone in the South China Sea. What does this mean? A direct challenge to China's 9-dash line. Vietnam played this move strategically. It knows that engaging in direct naval conflict with China would be a losing battle, but if it secures legal recognition from the United Nations first, it can later use international courts to undermine China's claims step by step. The ultimate goal is to pressure China into negotiations and even force concessions. On August 9th last year, Vietnam and the Philippines held their first ever joint Coast Guard exercise in Manila Bay, a clear challenge to China's claims in the South China Sea. But despite this, Vietnam cannot completely ignore China. That's why, after To Lam became General Secretary, his first foreign visit in August was to Beijing. He went to address Vietnam's massive trade deficit with China. He needed more Chinese investment to help balance this issue. Among the 14 cooperation agreements signed during the visit, one stood out: the railway track conversion project. Here's the issue. China's railway system uses standard gauge, 1,435 mm, while Vietnam's railway system still follows the old meter gauge, 1,000 mm. It's a holdover from the colonial era. This means that Chinese trains can't run directly into Vietnam, and Vietnamese trains can't enter China. Every time goods are transported across the border, they have to be unloaded, switched to a different train, and reloaded onto new tracks, a complicated and costly process. For years, China has pushed Vietnam to standardize its tracks, and this time, Vietnam finally agreed. China was thrilled because, to Beijing, this feels like pulling Vietnam deeper into its economic orbit. So when To Lam visited China, he took the opportunity to present this track conversion plan and let China pay for it. China gladly agreed to invest. If Vietnam converts its railways to standard gauge, China's freight trains will be able to travel seamlessly from Guangxi into Vietnam and all the way to Southeast Asia. But does Vietnam really want closer connectivity with China? It's not that simple. Vietnam agreed to the track conversion mainly because it lacks funding. Vietnam's railway infrastructure is severely outdated. Many of its tracks date back to the French colonial era, and its trains run at painfully slow speeds. Even the Vietnamese themselves complain about it. But upgrading the railway system is expensive, and the Vietnamese government simply doesn't have the money to do it alone. What's more, the Vietnamese have another trick up their sleeve, a dual track system. That is, on the key trunk line, two types of tracks were laid at the same time. One is meter gauge and the other is standard gauge. In this way, Vietnam's old trains can still run, and Chinese trains can also come in. It can not only obtain Chinese investment, but also retain its original rail system and not be completely controlled by China. Of course, switching railway gauges is just one part of economic cooperation between the two sides. Vietnam's attitude towards China has always been one of biting the hand that feeds it, economically dependent on China, but politically striving to break away from it. Beyond railway gauge conversion, there are several key areas of cooperation. China hopes to establish a land Silk Road from Guangxi to Vietnam, creating a stable logistics corridor. Meanwhile, Vietnam hopes China will further ease import quotas on Vietnamese agricultural products such as fruits, seafood, and coffee, allowing its agricultural exports to access a larger market. Chinese companies are also setting up factories in Vietnam, hoping to enhance Vietnam's manufacturing capabilities, particularly in sectors like electronics and auto parts. But will these cooperations really bring China and Vietnam closer together? Not necessarily. The Two Corridors, One Circle initiative is a regional economic integration plan led by China, covering Guangxi, Guangdong, Yunnan, Hainan, Hong Kong, and Macau. It has a total area of 140,000 square kilometers and a population of about 40 million. The core of this plan is to strengthen economic cooperation between southern China and northern Vietnam, binding their markets, logistics, and industrial chains even more tightly together. Take a look at how these two corridors are laid out. The first corridor, from Nanning, China, through Lansong to Hanoi, Haiphong, and Quang Ninh in Vietnam. The second corridor goes from Kunming in China, through Lao Cai Province in Vietnam to Hanoi, Haiphong, and Quang Ninh. One Circle is an economic belt surrounding the Gulf of Tonkin, covering cities like Beihai, Qingzhou, and Fangchenggang in Guangxi, as well as Haiphong and Quang Ninh in Vietnam. China's goal is clear, to use economic ties to tightly bind northern Vietnam. Once the industrial chain becomes dependent on China, northern Vietnam will increasingly resemble an extension of China, ultimately achieving soft integration. But what does Vietnam think? Officials and business leaders in northern Vietnam have mixed feelings about Chinese investment. They rely on China for economic survival and are open to cooperation, but the South sees things differently. The business community in Ho Chi Minh City has always been closer to Western capital and has no interest in being absorbed into China's economic sphere. So the Vietnamese government has adopted a balanced strategy, welcoming Chinese investment in the north while maintaining a cautious stance in the south, actively attracting businesses from Japan, South Korea, Europe, and the United States. This way, Vietnam retains its ability to choose and prevents itself from being fully controlled by China.